Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone. Good to have our visitors. For those of you who have not been attending here much, well, we are covering the books of the Bible, the books of the Old Testament on Sunday nights, and tonight we're going to be looking at the book of Esther. Now, the keynote to this book is providence, as we will see when we go through this study. The book of Esther is, as the name suggests, a star. It is truly a gem of the Old Testament. And this book can inspire and encourage us so much. Now, the Jews had already returned home from captivity. They were back in their homeland. And this book shows how the providence of God watched over them. The whole book confirms David's statement that's made in Psalm 37, verses 12 and 13. The wicked plotteth against the just, and gnasheth upon him with his teeth. The Lord shall laugh at him, for he seeth that his day is coming. Not all of the Jews, of course, left their land of captivity. Some had actually become wealthy, and they were happy there, and they decided to remain in the land of Persia, in Babylon. But this is the story of those who were left behind. Now, the author of this book is unknown. Some suggest it could have been Mordecai. Some say it was Ezra. We just don't know. But when you go through this book, it's always good to sit down and read through the whole book at one sitting because it is a beautiful and perfect story. It encourages faith in dangerous times. It shows God's wonderful providence. Now, the peculiar thing about this book is the name of God is not mentioned anywhere in the book. But yet we see the providence of God on every single page. It acquaints us with the workings of wicked men. We learn that the righteous should never slack off, never shrink back, but we need to fight on to the victory. And this book teaches us that we can expect God to protect his people. These things were written for our learning, so let's see what we can learn from them. Now, King Ahasuerus, he reigned from 485 to 464 BC, according to secular history. He secured his throne, and he had subdued all of his enemies, and his kingdom was at peace at this time. The first chapter opens with a feast that was made for his princes and servants, probably to show the king's greatness. And in this feast, the king's wealth, his grandeur, his power was put on display that he might receive the praise and the flattery from his foreign visitors. After the first feast, the king made another one. This time it was for all of the people. This feast was to last 7 days, and it took place in his garden. And this was a beautiful place, but we should never be deceived by its beautiful scenery, its physical beauty, because it would soon become a thriving den for vice and corruption. We're told in Esther chapter 1, verse 8, that the wine flowed freely. It says, and the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. No one was forced to drink, but it seems like they all did. Human nature just hasn't changed much over the years, has it? No one is forced to drink the alcoholic beverages. We all do it by choice if we do it, just like these people here. We're also introduced to a very noble woman whose name was Queen Vashti. Her name meant beautiful or excellent woman. While the king's feast was going on, she made a feast for the women. The women in that time did not ever mingle with the men, or vice versa. On the seventh day, the king's heart was very merry with wine. He commanded that Vashti come and show off her beauty before all these drunken revelers. Vashti, knowing the purpose of all this, denied the request. Well, historians tell us that the king actually demanded that she come and dance before them naked. Her courage was equal to her modesty. She refused, but after a hasty council with the wise men, well, it was decided that she would be taken care of according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. Her refusal cost her her crown, possibly her life, but her virtue and her honor were spared. You know, if we could have just more women like Vashti in the world today, we would live in a much better place. We have hundreds of thousands of young women in America today that are being taught by their mothers to take off their clothes in order to make a living or to seduce men. And you know, abbreviated attire on the streets has caused more adultery in the hearts of men than anything else we know of. The council decided that Vashti's crown should be taken from her. Letters be sent all throughout the province telling her what she did so that other wives would not rebel against their husbands. You know, God never intended for a man to treat his wife as a slave. And also, he never intended for women to obey every command of the husband, especially if it was not in keeping with God's law. As we're told in Acts 5, verse 29, it is better to obey God than men. Chapter 2 finds the king. He's sobering up a little bit. He's regretting what he's done, but it's too late. The law was passed. Vashti was doomed. And with her dethronement, now that calls for a search for a new queen. So fair young maidens all over the provinces are sought out. And the process of bathing and perfuming and various adornings are ministered to them. Myrrh and odors are used for 6 months before they are brought before the king. So they're really dolled up for him. This, of course, also would give ample time to see if they were with child or truly chaste. All of the young maidens would, of course, wind up being his concubines, but only one would be his queen. In verse 5 of chapter 2, we become acquainted with another of the major characters of this story, and that is a Jew by the name of Mordecai. He was the son of Jair. He was a Benjamite, a descendant of Kish, so he was kin to King Saul. Esther was his cousin. Now, apparently he was quite a bit older than her because she looked upon him as her father since she had lost both of her parents. Well, Mordecai brings Esther to the king's palace, and it says the maiden pleased the king whenever he saw her. But it was unknown to everyone that she was a Jew, because Mordecai said, "Do not make that known." Well, Mordecai went by the king's palace almost every day, hoping to see Esther. The maidens were finally paraded before the king, and Esther was looked upon above all the others. And the crown was placed upon her head, chapter 2, verse 17. Mordecai continued to sit at the king's gate, and one day he heard of a plot against the king's life. So he told Esther. Esther told the king. And the conspirators were hanged on the tree. The king's life was spared, and Mordecai's good deed was recorded in the king's chronicles. Now, of course, no story is complete without a villain, and this story is no exception. And the villain's name was Haman. He was a descendant of Agag, the one that Agag, the one that Saul had spared. So King Ahasuerus, he promotes Haman to the level of prime minister of the nation above all other princes. By order of the king, all of the servants were bow down to Haman as he passed by, but Mordecai never would do this. Haman expected divine reverence, and Mordecai refused to do that very thing. He knew this was a form of idolatry and something that God did not justify. You know, it's still wrong today to give homage to a man, the homage that belongs to God. You know, David said in Psalm 111, verse 9, "Holy and reverend is his name." And we find so many people today desiring to wear the name reverend. You know that word reverend, that's the only place it's ever found in the Bible is Psalm 111, verse 9. And it belongs to God. And never should we take on sacred titles that belong to God himself. When the servants asked Mordecai why he refused to prostrate himself before Haman, he let them know that he was a Jew. And they went and told Haman this. And from that time on, those two became mortal enemies. So Haman begins to plot, not just against Mordecai, but against the whole Jewish nation. Mordecai made his position plain so that no one could misunderstand. Now, the depths to which Haman, the hatred that he would move to, is seen in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. He tricked the king into destroying the whole nation of the Jews because he hated one Jew, and that was Mordecai. Lots were cast to see which of the 12 months this plot would be executed. It's pretty obvious that Haman was a little superstitious, and this was going to work against him because he had no idea how long he was going to have to wait before this plan could be executed. The month of Adar was chosen. The king sealed the decree with his ring. The law couldn't be changed after this, not even by the king himself. And the decree said that the spoils of the slain Jews could be claimed by the slayer, which would make the destruction even more sure. In chapter 4, a number of significant events begin to unfold. Mordecai hears of this decree. He rends his clothes. He cries aloud on the street about this evil that's about to come upon all the Jews. This was to catch the attention of the people, but even more so of Queen Esther. In every province, the wailing was great. The message is relayed to Esther by a eunuch who waited on her. And as Haman's influence was for wrong, now Esther's influence is to be used for good. And she was encouraged by Mordecai that she needed to go to the king to tell him about this plot. And her first inclination was, let somebody else do that. Isn't that what most of us do when we're asked to do something in the church? Have you tried somebody else to do that instead of me? I think they're better suited for it. Esther knew that if she went before the king without being called, it could cost her her life. And she was concerned about that. But Mordecai reminds her that if she allows this decree to go through, she also will perish herself. And we all need to consider that. We need to consider the consequences of our inactions in the church today. He then told her what I think is the greatest verse in the whole book, chapter 4, verse 14. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom of God for such a time as this? We all have been called in the kingdom of God for a purpose. And if you are in the kingdom, then your time to act has come. It is time for us to do something. She sends a message back to Mordecai in verse 16, says, if I perish, I perish. She got the message loud and clear. Someone said, we know not of what we are capable until the trial comes. You know, we need to test ourselves sometimes. We don't know what we're capable of doing until we finally get out there and we get our feet wet. Esther went in, she fasted, she dressed so she could appear before the king. And touched by her beauty, he extends his scepter to her, meaning that she could enter. The hand of God was with her, because like I said, she could have been put to death because of her brazenness. But Esther pleads for her people, but she does so in a very shrewd way. When the king asked what she wanted, she says, I would like for you and Haman to come to a banquet that I would prepare. And they accepted the invitation. This banquet was preliminary to the main one, which would follow the very next day. And it was at that second banquet that Esther would make known her petition. Of course, you can only imagine that the curiosity was about to kill Haman and the king both about what this petition is going to be. Haman isn't suspecting anything. He thinks everything is hunky-dory, everything's going his way. He's filled with pride. He brags to his friends and his family how only he and the king are invited to this one banquet that was put on by the queen. He even brags to his wife about his riches, his promotion, his popularity, but Mordecai is still a thorn in his side. So his wife suggests to him, why don't you build a gallows to see to the demise of Mordecai? And that pleased Haman a lot. He said, that's a good idea. Haman's wife, therefore, became a contributor to this evil plot against the Jews. You know, a man's wife can either make him or break him, and that's why we're told in the Scriptures that an elder is to have a good wife. Haman's pride was the beginning of his fall. Proverbs 16, verse 18 says it very plain. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And Haman was about to fall, and he was going to fall headlong. Chapter 6 begins by informing us that the king had a restless night. So, because he couldn't sleep, he had the Chronicles read to him, and he finds out that the good deed that Mordecai had done that spared his life had never been rewarded. So when Haman comes in the next day, the king asked him, "What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor?" Well, Haman's pride spiked to the very top. He thought that the king was about to honor him. So Haman suggested that the royal apparel be put on this man, that he be put on the king's horse, paraded through the streets, and the princes proclaimed the king's pleasure in this man. Then came the blow. The king said, "Make haste and do so to Mordecai the Jew," chapter 6, verse 10. Imagine Haman's humiliation. I would have loved to have seen the look on his face when he heard that. He goes home. All of his bragging has ceased. And his wife realizes that Haman is about to fall before this Jew. Friends, you will fall before the one that you allow yourselves to hate. The banquet that he looked forward to, now something that he regrets. In chapter 7, Haman pays for his crimes. The king cannot wait to find out what Esther's petition is. And at the banquet, she explains that she and her people are about to be slain because of the dastardly act of Haman. Well, the king goes out into the garden to contemplate what he's going to do to Haman. But in the meantime, Haman goes into the queen's quarters, falls prostrate on her bed before her to plead for mercy, and in walks the king. And all he can think is that he's trying to force himself upon the queen. One of the chamberlains reminds the king that there is a gallows outside, and the king says of Haman, "Hang him thereon." He was hung on his own gallows, Haman was, and the king's wrath was appeased. Events now begin to move at a pretty rapid pace in chapter 9. Mordecai is exalted. He's placed over Haman's house, so the humble is now exalted. Esther then begs for this law to be changed, but the king says even he cannot change it once he put his signature on that law. But what he does do is he enacts another law which says the Jews can defend themselves against any transgressor. They could destroy, they could slay, they could cause to perish all who would oppress them. And you know, that's the very same words that Haman himself used, talking about what he wanted to do to the Jews. Chapter 9 tells of the slaughter that the Jews heaped upon those who tried to oppress them. Haman's 10 sons were hung on the very gallows that Haman himself had built and was hung on himself. And so the Jews were saved from the destruction. The day of Purim was enacted to celebrate the deliverance of these Jews. Chapter 10 then closes the book with Mordecai ruling in a position just right below the king himself. Esther's actions should encourage us to act in order to overcome our spiritual enemies that hinder us. And believe me, we've got lots of them out there. God is going to work with those who are willing to help themselves. But if we're not willing to help ourselves, we're going to be on our own. If Esther was not willing to act, then God would have found somebody else, and deliverance to the Jews would have come through somebody else. Esther chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. You know, Paul said, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. We can work with God and we can overcome, or we can sit back and perish. The choice is really ours. Now, if you are not a citizen in the kingdom, then you're going to find yourself working against God. And that's not a good place to be. God is the only one who can save us. And we must work with him. But you can't do it outside of his kingdom. because you're working for some other ruler. If you're not in the kingdom, have not been baptized for the remission of your sins, you have the opportunity to do so tonight. If you are a citizen of the kingdom and yet you're not working, you're not doing what you should do, you also will perish. We're not here to ride our parents' coattails into heaven or just to slide into heaven secretly. There's something that we must be doing. We must be about the work. Jesus was a busy man. He went about his Father's business, and we are too. And if there's anything that you need to make things right before God, whatever it may be, if we can help you, won't you respond while together we stand and sing.